Thank you. All right, I'm not going to ask if there are any economists in the room, so obviously there are, so my job is a little bit harder then. I'm going to present preliminary results of a simple empirical study of how the educational mismatches affect the earnings premia in Poland, and especially I'll focus on the position of the graduates, which are simply defined as people who do not continue their education and are under 30 years old. So that's the main task of this simple empirical investigation. So the presentation outline looks quite standard. So first I'm going to talk a little about the motivation, then about the literature findings, then I'll present the data and the methodology used, and then some results with some brief discussions and early conclusions. So first, why to study the issues related to the mismatch or the educational mismatches or skill mismatches or something like this? It's quite common in the literature to say that the high mismatch or the high incidence of the educational mismatches could be a sign of a suboptimal allocation of resources in the economy. So when people are poorly matched to the jobs they do, something is lost in the economy. I mean, some resources are wasted, and clearly this is a suboptimal allocation of precious and scarce resources in the economy. And there is also a question of rationality of spending public money on education when people tend to do something which is not directly related to their future jobs. So then again, there is a question of why the government should subsidize the education process in this way, producing or leading to a substantial waste of the resources. From the point of view of employers, it might be argued that the high costs of recruitment arise because then they need to devise some kind of screening procedures to test and reveal the true productivity of people. So that might increase the costs of training, and then, of course, some additional training has to be provided to bridge the gaps that are found. Okay, and the last reason is that it is also interesting from the point of view of the policymakers, which try to design a kind of policy changes or the reforms for the educational systems, trying to increase the efficiency of the matching between the labor supply and the labor demand. Of course, it's very hard to follow. Labor demand changes or the evolution are probably much quicker and happen in advance. So it's very hard to catch up. But anyway, it might be interesting if there is any way to try to decrease the scale of the waste of resources in this way. The literature findings in this area are quite diversified, I would say. The theoretical grounds for the incidence of overeducation especially were laid out by the famous works by Spence in 1973, which is the signaling theory of education, and then the alternative view could be seen as an idea of thorough theory of job competition model. There are some other ideas trying to explain the existence and the incidence of why people tend to overeducate themselves in the labor market. There is also a huge literature, the empirical literature providing the evidence on how the mismatches impact on the wages in the labor market. There is a famous paper by Duncan and Hoffman in 1981, which started a new empirical approach to the study, moving from rather aggregate studies into more microeconomic analysis using micro-level data. And then there are really there is a huge amount of evidence in the empirical works to just list a few of them. And the results are that the incidence of overeducation is positively influenced by the labor force growth, and there is also a negative effect on unemployment on returns to education. Allen van der Velden have shown a negative effect for wage returns of the skill mismatches. Also in terms of job satisfaction, which was also negatively impacted by skill mismatches. And there are also other studies which show that the skill mismatches or education mismatches are also responsible for higher wage inequality in the countries. So that could add up to the discussion of the wage dispersion in the countries that is observed. There are three main approaches to the problem of measurement of the mismatch in education. So basically the three approaches are used. So the first one is based on the worker's self-assessment. So in the surveys, which is the most common way to state what is the level of or the scale of the mismatch, is to ask people what do they feel about their jobs they are performing and what is the most suitable level of education they should have in performing the current job that they do. So that's one way of the procedure. The second is the information based on the job description. So going into more detail of how the jobs are described, what kind of tasks are required to perform. And the third approach is based on the realized worker-job matches, when we look at the employment and employer connections matches realized on the labor market, and then see on the let's say the features of the workplace, and the features and the characteristics, the personal characteristics of the persons who perform those jobs. The data that I'm going to use, or I have used for this empirical study, comes from the Polish Labor Force Survey, second quarter of 2013, which covers a little under 90,000 individuals aged 15 or more, of which a little slightly under 40,000 are employed. It allows to use the third approach, the informations on realized worker-job matches, since we have the information about the education level and we have information about the job characteristics that are the jobs that are performed. So basing on Kicker approach, for each a three-digit occupation, there is defined a dominant occupation level based on the distribution of the education levels within each three-digit job, and then the dominant education level for each job is defined as the one that is mostly common or required to perform the type of job, and then simply a measure of over or under education is simply the difference between what is the dominant level of education for the given three-digit job and the education level actually possessed by the person under study. So the person is said to be either overeducated or undereducated if there is a difference, positive or negative difference, between what is observed and what is stated as required or as the dominant level of education. So this allows to create undereducation and overeducation dummies for each person, and then to put them into the regression for the wage regression and test if these come out as being significant predictors of the wages in the wage regression model. The second approach relies on the paper by Duncan and Hoffman. So rather than using the dominant level of education, it is transformed into the required years of education for this dominant type of education, and then the actual years of schooling is decomposed into three components using this quite standard methodology of decomposition into the years of overeducation, years of undereducation, and the years of required schooling. So this actual number of years at school is decomposed into these three components, and those three components are then put into the wage regression and then checked for their significance also. So basic look at the data. So after defining these measures, we can see what is the incidence of overeducation and undereducation broken down by some characteristics of the population under study. So it can be seen that the overeducation is a little more evident for men than for women, but on the other hand, undereducation happens more often for women than men. And it's what is mostly evident also is that the incidence of overeducation is much more likely for people under 25, so for relatively young participants of the labor market, and then it slowly goes down. While the incidence of undereducation, here this relation with age is not so clear. So roughly one fourth of the labor force is stated as being overeducated, and roughly the same share is stated as being undereducated. These are the variables that were used in the wage regression. So typically standard variables that are commonly used in the wage regressions, like gender, education, age, having children in the household under 5 years old, disability, marital status, the class of settlement unit, the sector, whether public or private, and firm size, and the current job tenure measured in months. So the first approach was to use these undereducation and overeducation dummies in the standard wage regression approach, and then to check if these dummies are significant predictors of wages, and the wages are treated as logs of hourly net earnings in the primary job. And these are the results for just some subsample of the parameters, which obviously the table would be much too long to present all of them. But the most important ones are here in this place for these overeducation and undereducation dummies. So going to conclusions from this first set of estimates that have been obtained is that we can summarize the first results, that we have a substantial and significant returns to formal education with employees holding MA diplomas earn on average something like 42% more than their colleagues of the reference category, which is a secondary general education. It appears that the returns to MA degree are higher for women than for men. I mean, compared to the reference category again. Okay. As far as the overeducation and undereducation dummies are concerned, it appears that there is a negative wage premium attributed to being overeducated. So being overeducated results in a wage penalty of about 14% on average. So quite surprisingly, maybe, although the incidence of the overeducation is much more common among the young participants on the labor market, the wage penalty appears to be much lower for this group on the labor market. So it happens that the wage penalty for those youngest participants of the labor market is only 8%. As compared to the reference category, which is the group which does not exhibit overeducation or undereducation at all. Another result is that the overeducation seems to penalize women more than men, 16 to 13%. The difference is not very big. On the other hand, being undereducated is associated with a significant wage premium of about something roughly about 7% on average. Okay. The second approach, as I said, was to use this Duncan and Hoffman approach. So instead of having these undereducation and overeducation dummies, the decomposed years of schooling into three categories of the required schooling and years of overeducation and years of undereducation were were put into the regression for wages. So the specification of this equation is exactly the same. Instead of having those dummies, we have the variables for the years of schooling. And the results are the following. So again, we can see some significant parameters for these variables of overeducation, required schooling, and undereducation. So we can see that the required schooling each year brings about a return of about 11% for the required schooling, and each year of overeducation has much reduced rate of return as compared to the required schooling component of the years of education, which is quite typically found in the papers using this kind of procedure. So it's a quite common result. When we look at the difference between the whole sample and the sample for the youngest participants of the labor market, the striking difference is that there is no significant return to the years of overeducation, while this return to the years of undereducation is much smaller in absolute terms than for the average for the whole population. The conclusions are that the results are quite similar when we use the first or the second procedure. What is interesting is that the return to each year of required schooling seems to be a little higher than what is observed for other studies in the literature. Most typically, what is found for the countries like the USA is that each year of the required schooling brings about something, I think, about 8% return for each year of required schooling, and each year of overeducation brings about half the return for the required schooling, which is typically found in the literature. Here, for the Polish data, this is roughly equal to the half, but slightly less probably than the half. So it's quite comparable in range, I would say, but a little lower than the half of the rate of return for the required schooling. The hypothesis of the standard Mincer wage regression being a special case of the Duncan-Hoffman model is strongly rejected, as the other variables are also significant predictors of the wage in the model, so it cannot be argued that the Mincer model is a special case of this Duncan and Hoffman. The symmetry of returns to over and under education is also is not rejected only for men. For other subgroups on the labor market, it seems that these are quite symmetric of the opposite signs. So, which is also very common to find in the literature. My summary for the first and the preliminary results would be that the estimation of the wage models resulted in finding some significant positive wage returns to undereducation, while finding negative wage returns associated with the overeducation dummy. The problem of the wage penalty for the youngest graduates does not seem to be that much severe as compared to the whole sample used for the study, which seems to indicate that it doesn't necessarily have to be the sign, this wage penalty for being overeducated doesn't necessarily be the sign of having lower ability, but maybe attributed due to more frequent job changes before moving to the jobs to which those graduates might be better matched. It's the initial stage of the professional career, so the movement between the jobs is much more frequent than at the later stages in the professional career. So that might be simply a reflection of the fact that also those mostly more frequent job changes reflect also the fact that at least for some of them the mismatch might be more likely for these people. But of course, it would be very nice to have a kind of panel data analysis for this kind of problem to see whether these mismatches are a kind of stable or not over time. So how persistent are these effects, and how do they affect the evolution of wages over the life cycle? So that would require a longer panel data studies, which are not available yet, I'm afraid, for Poland. So we'll have to wait a little for this data to come, and then this would be a natural extension what to do in the future. So thank you for your time.